The guard still thought he was in charge. That was the first thing the Americans noticed about him. The war was all but over. His army was in ruins. The prisoners he had spent years tormenting were about to walk free. And yet he stood there at the gate with his shoulders squared and his voice raised, barking threats at men he no longer had any power over. He had spent so long as a small king of a cruel little world that he could not understand. The world had changed. And then a convoy of American vehicles rolled through the gate, and the man stepping out of the lead car was about to teach him that lesson in the space of a single minute. This is a story about authority, the real kind and the false kind, and about a moment when one collided with the other. It is a story about what happens when a man who has ruled through fear meets a man who has earned the right to command and discovers, far too late, that the two are not the same thing at all. And it centers on George S. Patton in the final weeks of the war in Europe, when his Third Army was overrunning the dark places of the collapsing Reich and finding things that would stay with his soldiers for the rest of their lives. To set the scene properly, you have to remember what the spring of 1945 actually looked like. The German war machine was disintegrating. Patton's forces were advancing so fast that the maps could barely keep up, liberating towns, overrunning positions, and, with grim regularity, coming upon the camps. These were not battlefields. They were something else, something that the men who saw them struggled to put into words. Hardened soldiers who had endured years of combat walked through those gates and came out changed, quieter, with a cold fury settling into them that no enemy on a battlefield had ever produced. Patton himself was no stranger to this. He had visited such a place, walked its grounds, and forced himself to look at the evidence directly. By his own account, the experience sickened him. This was a man who had built his whole life around war, who loved the profession of arms, who believed in glory and courage and the clash of armies. But what he saw in the camps was not war. It was something that war was supposed to have rules against, and the men who had run these places had treated those rules as if they did not exist. Patton carried that knowledge with him, and it changed how he saw every guard, every overseer, every petty tyrant of that monstrous system. So when he arrived at a camp where a guard was still throwing his weight around, still threatening the very prisoners who were now under American protection, the collision was inevitable. Now we should be honest about what we are describing here. Scenes like this unfolded across the liberated territories in countless variations, as Allied troops took control of camps and confronted the men who had staffed them. What follows is a dramatized retelling, grounded in the documented reality of those liberations and in everything we know about how Patton thought and acted. The specifics are recreated to bring the moment to life, but the heart of it, the clash between false authority and true accountability, is as real as anything in the war. Picture the guard, then. He represents a particular kind of man that the regime produced in great numbers, not a frontline soldier who had faced an armed enemy, but a jailer, someone whose entire sense of power came from standing over the helpless. He had spent the war in a position where a single word from him could mean life or death for people who could not fight back. That kind of power is intoxicating, and it is also hollow because it was never really his. It was loaned to him by a system, and it only worked as long as the people beneath him had no defenders. He had simply never imagined a day when those defenders would arrive. That day had now come, and it arrived in the form of an American general who had absolutely no patience for him. When the guard continued his threats, when he tried to assert that these prisoners were still his to command, Patton's response was immediate and total. There was no debate, no negotiation, no acknowledgement of the man's imagined authority. Patton made it instantly, brutally clear that the guard's reign was finished, that the people he had been threatening were now under the protection of the United States Army, and that the only person who would be answering for anything from this point forward was the guard himself. The reversal in that moment was complete, and it must have been dizzying for the man on the receiving end. For years he had been the one who issued threats, and now he was the one being warned. For years he had decided who lived in fear, and now fear had come for him. Patton did not need to lay a hand on him to accomplish this. The sheer weight of real authority, backed by an army that had just conquered a continent, was enough. The Guard had ruled a tiny kingdom of barbed wire. Patton commanded one of the most powerful military forces on Earth, and he had arrived to dismantle that kingdom entirely. What makes this moment more than just a satisfying confrontation is what it reveals about the difference between two kinds of power. The guard had wielded authority through cruelty, through the ability to hurt people who could not resist. It felt like strength, but it was actually the opposite. It was the weakness of a man who could only dominate the defenseless. Patton's authority was of a completely different nature. It was the authority of a commander who led men into battle, who took responsibility for victory and defeat, who had earned his position through a lifetime of service in the most demanding profession there is. One man's power evaporated the instant a stronger force appeared. The other man's power was the stronger force. And there is something deeper still in Patton's reaction, something that connects to his fury about the camps themselves. When he confronted that guard, he was not just asserting military control. He was making a moral statement about accountability. The inner horror of the camps had been built on the idea that the people running them would never have to answer for what they did, that they could commit any atrocity in the service of the regime and remain untouchable. Patton's message to that guard shattered that idea. It announced that the age of impunity was over, that the men who had done these things would now be held to account, and that no amount of bluster could change the fact that the world had finally come to judge them. Consider what this meant for the prisoners watching. These were people who had been systematically stripped of every shred of dignity and power, who had lived for years at the mercy of men exactly like this guard. They had watched these tormentors operate with total impunity, had learned through brutal experience that resistance was met with death, that the guards held all the power and they held none. And now, suddenly, they were watching that entire order collapse. They were seeing one of their oppressors put firmly in his place by a force far greater than him. For people who had been taught that their suffering would never end and would never be acknowledged, that moment carried a weight almost beyond description. It is worth pausing on that, because it is easy to focus on Patton and the guard and forget the people whose fate was actually at stake. The prisoners were not just spectators to this confrontation. They were the reason it mattered. Every word Patton spoke in defense of them was a reversal of years of dehumanization. The system had told these people they were worth nothing, that no one would ever come for them, that they would simply disappear. And here was a general of a victorious army, making it absolutely clear that they were now under his protection, that their tormentors' threats meant nothing, and that someone with overwhelming power had arrived specifically to stand between them and their abusers. Patton was not a sentimental man, and he would not have framed it in soft terms. But his actions in those liberated camps spoke clearly. He ordered that the survivors be cared for. He insisted that the local population be made to see what had been done, marching civilians through to witness the evidence so that no one could later claim ignorance. And when a guard dared to threaten the people now under his protection, he crushed that threat without hesitation. These were not the gestures of a man who saw the prisoners as an afterthought. They were the actions of a soldier who understood that part of winning the war was ensuring that its victims were finally defended and its perpetrators finally held to account. The lesson in this confrontation echoes far beyond that single gate. It is a lesson about the fundamental fragility of power built on cruelty. The guard had believed his authority was real because it had never been tested by anything stronger. But power that depends entirely on the helplessness of your victims is not power at all. It is a temporary arrangement that lasts only until someone stronger arrives to end it. The moment a real force appeared, the guard's entire identity collapsed, because it had been built on nothing but the suffering of people who could not fight back. True authority, the kind Patton wielded, does not evaporate when challenged. It is the thing that does the challenging. There is also a warning embedded here for anyone who mistakes brutality for strength. Throughout history, tyrants and their servants have made the same error, confusing the ability to terrorize the weak with genuine power. They surround themselves with the trappings of dominance and come to believe they are invincible. But the camp guard standing at that gate, still issuing threats as his world crumbled, is the perfect image of how that delusion ends. The strong man discovers at the worst possible moment that he was never strong, only cruel, and that cruelty offers no protection at all when accountability finally arrives. By the time Patton finished with him, the guard understood his new reality. The kingdom of fear he had ruled was gone. The prisoners he had threatened were free and protected, and he himself now faced the prospect of answering for everything he had done. This was the new order that the Allied victory was bringing to the dark corners of the Reich, an order in which the perpetrators would be named, documented, and judged, and in which their victims would finally be acknowledged as human beings deserving of protection and justice. What stays with us about this story is the clarity of it. In a war full of moral complexity and impossible choices, here was a moment of perfect moral simplicity. A man who had abused the helpless was confronted by a force that would no longer allow it. There was no ambiguity, no difficult calculation, just the clean satisfaction of seeing false authority stripped away and real accountability take its place. Patton, for all his flaws and all his complications, stood in that moment as the embodiment of a simple and powerful truth, that the reign of those who terrorize the defenseless does eventually end, and that when it does, their bluster is revealed as the empty thing it always was. So remember the guard at the gate, still playing the tyrant as his world fell apart around him, unable to grasp that his power had vanished the moment a stronger and more just force arrived. And remember the general who put him in his place, not with violence, but with the simple, crushing weight of genuine authority, backed by an army of liberation. It is a reminder that cruelty is not strength, that the helpless do not stay helpless forever, and that there comes a day for every petty tyrant who ever mistook fear for respect when someone finally walks through the gate and tells them the truth.